Welcome to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are catholicism.org and reconquest.net. My email address is bam@catholicism.org. That's BAM@catholicism.org. I can be found either on Twitter @brother_Andre and on Facebook. Tonight's show is on distributism, economics as if God and the family matter. My guest is in the second segment will be Mr. John Sharp, the co-founder and managing director of IHS Press, which publishes a lot of titles about this subject and other subjects pertaining to the social teaching of the Catholic Church. Now, you all know that this show's unapologetically, confessionally Catholic. Many of the truths that we discuss on this show are truths of the supernaturally revealed variety, things pertaining to the Trinity or the Incarnation or the saints or things of that nature, Holy Scripture and so forth, as taught and safeguarded by the magisterium of the Catholic Church. Now, the Church is divinely appointed as the teacher of mankind. And she has a role in safeguarding and handing down not only the divine positive law, which we know as Scripture and tradition, in other words, what's been divinely supernaturally revealed, but also the divine law written on man's heart, which we also call the natural law or the moral law. Because of this, and because the Church has a vested interest in man living his temporal life in a virtuous manner that is conducive to his supernatural end, the Church has a clearly articulated social doctrine that rests firmly on the natural law. And again, when I say the natural law, I don't mean the law of physics or the law of chemistry or the laws of gravity or things like that. I'm talking about the moral law, which is naturally knowable to all. This interest of the Church in temporal things includes man's political and economic life, both of which are to be governed by principles of justice, and both of which ought to help and not to hinder man's eternal salvation. One of the horrible realities of modernity is what the late great Father Dennis Fahey called the inversion of goods, meaning the topsy-turvydom of what we might call values today, putting first things last instead of putting first things first, and putting last things first. We see it in the realm of economics in this way. Money, which is also called coin wealth, exists as a means of exchange for real wealth, that is, the tangible goods that man needs, such as food, shelter, and clothing. And this real wealth exists for the good of man. Now, that's the way that it should be. But that order is inverted in the modern economy. How? Well, because man is reduced to a producer of goods, and the goods are there in order that money may be made. Now, of course, at the top of the food chain, there are other men, a very small amount of them, who make the money. But the point is, the vast majority of men are merely wage slaves working for this system where money's at the top of the food chain, then goods that men need or are told they need, and at the bottom of the food chain is man. So the hierarchy has been inverted, and this food chain, as we say, has been completely reversed. And this is to the detriment of man, and this is to the detriment especially of the family. Just as the purpose for men coming together in society is that they might live virtuously. This was a concept that the Greeks had, not just Catholics, not just Christians, but the pagan Greeks had this, and even the founding fathers of our republic had this, that men come together in a society that they might live virtuously. So too, the purpose of economic activity is to provide for man's temporal needs so that people may save their souls. In other words, in order to live virtuously, we have a certain need of temporal things. The destitute man is probably not going to be living a virtuous life. He's going to be stealing, he's going to be scrapping, doing whatever he can in order to survive. And he certainly won't have the leisure to raise his mind to higher things, not only the higher things of this life, which require an education and so forth, but eternal things. In short, when man is at the bottom of the food chain, he is degraded and his temporal life becomes a hindrance and not a help to his salvation. So the Church obviously has a vested interest in this. This fact was of grave concern to the popes who articulated the Church's social doctrine in the face of modernity's two dominant economic systems, namely monopoly capitalism or industrial capitalism or just capitalism on the one hand, and the collectivist forms of economics on the other, namely socialism and its more particular form of communism on the other. As an alternative to these two systems, which the thinkers we are here promoting would consider to be part of the same evil continuum, a group of English thinkers in the early 20th century, including Gilbert Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, but by no means limited to these two men, articulated a system called distributism. Its ideals were contrary both to socialism and to capitalism. Against the socialists, they advocated for private ownership, and against the capitalists, they advocated for the most widespread possible ownership of productive property, rather than the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. Their ideal can be summarized in these few words. They wanted a well-distributed ownership of productive property. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. I am your host, Brother Andre Marie, and we're talking about economics as if God and the family matter. So let's get to a little bit of what some distributists have written on the subject. And I don't have time, obviously, to read long excerpts, but in the 1926 tract written for the Distributist League and published in London called What is Distributism, a distributist thinker by the name of K.L. Kenrick distinguished distributism from its two alternatives in these words, quote, "There are three economic theories struggling for supremacy in the modern world. They are capitalism, the doctrine that property is best concentrated in large masses in the hands of a few people; socialism, the doctrine that property is best owned and controlled by the state," and of course socialism includes communism; and finally distributism, the doctrine that property is best divided up among the largest possible number of people. Broadly speaking, we may say, continuing with Kendrick's quote, broadly speaking, we may say that distributism means every man is his own master, as far as possible. Socialism means nobody is his own master, but the state is master of all. Capitalism means a select few are their own masters, the rest of us are their servants. Again, that's from a tract written by K.L. Kenrick, published by the Distributist League in London in 1926 and called What is Distributism? It may interest our Catholic listeners to know that Fulton Sheen actually echoed a lot of these ideas. I don't have time for the full quote, but it's in the introduction to a book published by IHS Press, again, headed by our guest this evening, Mr. John Sharp. He quotes this work of Fulton Sheen's, Communism and the Conscience of the West, from 1948. He says this: "If by capitalism is meant not diffused ownership of property, but monopolistic capitalism, in which capital bids for labor on a market and concentrates wealth in the hands of the few, then from an economic point of view alone, the Church is just as much opposed to capitalism as it is to communism. Communism emphasizes the social use to the exclusion of personal rights, and capitalism emphasizes personal rights to the exclusion of social use. The Church says both are wrong, for though the right to property is personal, the use is social. It therefore refuses to maintain capitalism as an alternative to the economic side of communism, it being the Church. Monopolistic capitalism concentrates wealth in the hands of a few capitalists, and communism in the hands of a few bureaucrats, and both end in the proletarianization of the masses. Wow, that's a hard word. The true Christian must rid himself of the delusion that in opposing communism, the Church thereby puts itself in opposition to all those who would seek to change the present economic system, which of course was capitalist. He's speaking in America in the 1940s. The Christian concept denies there is an absolutely owned private property exclusive of limits set by the common good of the community and responsibility to the community. The more anonymous and impersonalistic property becomes, the less is the right to it. The Church agrees with communism in its protestations against the injustice of the economic order, but it parts with it in the collectivity being made the sole employer. For this reduces the individual to the status of a serf or slave of the state. Concentration of wealth is wrong whether it is done on the Hudson or on the Volga. End of quote. Now, there's a lot more to the quote, as I said, than that. Very articulate statement. And he didn't identify himself, I don't think, as a distributist, but he is identifying their ideals here. He's articulating their ideals. In perennial philosophy, economics, like politics, is studied as part of the science of ethics. I know that sounds like a bad joke today, that politics and economics are part of the science of ethics, the philosophy of ethics, but it's true. Therefore, economics are subject to the moral law. And we cannot reasonably argue, as many do, many laissez-faire capitalists, that the blind forces of the market need no outside law since they themselves establish wages and price and so forth. Man is simply too prone to evil for that to work. And mind you, people will say that it works. Yes, but for whom does it work? Does it work for the family? Does it work for man as a whole? No, it works for the few who get rich off of it. Over and above the necessity of economics being subject to the moral law, though, the distributists advocated that ownership of productive property by a family is a moral good that the economic order of society must defend and facilitate, which of course means that the laws are going to protect the family in this regard. My guest tonight would agree, I think. This has been the common opinion of all the sources of Catholic teaching on social questions, as well as the teaching of the popes who most clearly articulated the social doctrine in the face of an economically perverse modernity. Now, those popes would be principally Popes Leo XIII, Pius XI, and Pius XII. Common Catholic and natural law principles led others in continental Europe and in America to oppose the two dominant economic systems of modernity. Of course, communism or socialism and capitalism we're talking about. The Jesuit father Heinrich Pesch advocated a system known as solidarism, and the French Catholic layman René de la Tour du Pin worked for a system known as corporatism, which applied these principles of the Catholic Church's social doctrine to industrialism. Again, implied the principles of the widest possible distribution of productive property. He applied it to industrialism. In America, there were the famous Southern agrarians who did cooperate at times directly with the English distributists. Up here in Yankee Land, where I'm from now, where I live now, in New Hampshire, there was also a distributist league of New England. These guys were also in communication with the English distributists. One of the most authentic voices of traditional American conservatism, Richard Weaver, echoed these ideals in his 1948 classic, Ideas Have Consequences. People, by the way, will attack distributism as liberal, as a gateway to socialism, as sort of backdoor socialism, which it's not. All the distributist thinkers were very anti-socialist. But here's one little arrow to have in your quiver if you get into that argument. One of the most authentic voices of American conservatism. If there is an American conservatism, if there is a conservatism in the United States that harkens back to the tradition of Europe, if there is such a thing as an American conservatism, this man articulated it, and this is Richard Weaver. In his book, Ideas Have Consequences, and he wrote an awful lot more than that. But in his 1948 book, Ideas Have Consequences, you do see a lot of these ideas articulated. Again, the idea of the most widely diffused possible ownership of productive property. You see it in Weaver's 1948 book. From the early part of the 20th century through the 1920s and the 30s, these alternative views to capitalism and socialism were seriously challenging the status quo. But this essentially conservative, traditional, and humane vision of life and its accompanying critique of modernity was eclipsed after World War II. Some attribute this to the new synthesis of conservatism that arose in reaction to the Red Menace. Anti-communism formed a new political right, which, in John Sharp's words, joined a certain social conservatism with an apologia for corporate capitalism and an interventionist foreign policy. End quote. By and large, this new synthesis is what now passes for conservatism, along with the more liberty-loving strain that we call libertarianism. And of course, the libertarians are not going to be friendly to this concept of distributism either, because they're the ones who most vociferously defend laissez-faire capitalism and talk about the market being a self-sustaining thing. It doesn't need any moral checks on it. Let me point out that the big business capitalist is not always opposed to big government when it suits his purpose. In other words, he might talk the talk of freedom from government interference when it comes especially to his bank account. But he's not adverse to using the big government when it helps him. For all his protestations of freedom and so forth, he's not adverse to a little eminent domain land grab here, a la Donald Trump, or a little protectionism there, as in the case of the pharmaceutical industry's very unhealthy alliance with the AMA and the FDA. Oh yes, and unhealthy was a joke, just in case you missed that. Okay, we're talking about health, right? For the purposes of profit. So these guys are profiteering. The pharmaceutical industry, big pharma as it's sometimes called, makes obscene profits, and the FDA rubber stamps a lot of their products, which of course are poisoning much of the American populace. And they have this sort of monopoly on healthcare, and you can't be taken seriously, doctors who prescribe alternative things like herbs, because an herb that helps somebody cannot be trademarked. It doesn't have a formula that can be trademarked. It's not good for these big businesses. So all of the alternative stuff you're going to find that actually works will have a label on it saying that this hasn't been tested by the FDA. All these claims that this is not intended to treat, diagnose any disease. So things that actually help people and don't make them sicker, which a lot of these pharmaceutical products do, aren't taken seriously by the FDA. So you have big government in league with big business, and they're making big profit, and it's harming people. I think the distributists of the 20s and 30s would be ranting against this stuff way more than I am right now. Let's not forget also the obscene amounts of money made by the military-industrial complex with all the unjust wars that it prosecutes for the purposes of freedom? No, for the purposes of profit. For the purposes of profit. Lots of people that make obscene, disgusting amounts of money off of the blood of American serving men in the military who go abroad to fight these unjust wars, many of them well-intentioned, of course, but they're getting killed for no good reason. This is crony capitalism at its worst and almost at its most murderous. Of course, the dubious distinction of the most murderous crony capitalism probably belongs to that other unnatural marriage between big government and that private federation of companies known as Planned Parenthood. Where the capitalism begins and the socialism ends here escapes me, because there are private stakeholders that stand to profit a lot and do profit a lot from this union of the government with a baby-killing industry. To me, anyway, all of this confirms the truth of Belloc's assertion that capitalism and communism are, quote, hellish twins, end quote. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. I am Brother Andre Marie. When we come back after the break, we will be joined by my guest, Mr. John Sharp. Please keep listening.
You're listening to Reconquest with Brother Andre Marie, seeking that which was lost and fighting for it. Exclusively on the Veritas Radio Network's Crusade.
Welcome back to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. I'm Brother Andre Marie, coming to you from St. Benedict's Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are catholicism.org and reconquest.net. My email address is bam@catholicism.org. I'm easily found on Twitter at Brother_Andre and on Facebook. Tonight we're talking about distributism, economics as if God and the family matter. Joining me now via Skype is Mr. John Sharp, the founder and managing director of IHS Press, and something of an expert on the subject of distributism. Good evening, John.
Good evening, brother. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, and thank you so much for accepting it and for joining us.
My pleasure.
John, I just reread your introduction to the book Beyond Capitalism and Socialism that IHS Press published. The book has the subtitle, A New Statement of an Old Ideal. In that book, you make the point, or in that introduction, you say that the ideals of distributism, such as the widest possible distribution of productive property, are nothing new, but go back as far as medieval Christendom and even beyond that to ancient Greece and Rome. Could you speak to that for a little bit?
I would be glad to. You certainly set the stage as well as I could with your introductory remarks, surveying the range of people outside the so-called Chester Belloc who have articulated these ideals, or one or another aspect of them. In thinking about this larger question that you just raised while listening to your introduction, it occurred to me that there are some fundamentals that often get either overlooked or kind of presumed away even by the most praiseworthy advocates of distributism. Obviously, I won't name any names because all the positive press that these ideas can get is welcome. There's no question about that. But you probably have a sense, or listeners have a sense of what I'm referring to when you get certain groups that are so enamored with their favorite Catholic character, however absolutely praiseworthy and worthwhile this individual's life and work was, that the individual becomes more the focus than the ideas. And I don't think, I'll name Chesterton because he's dead, and that this is by no means a criticism. But
yeah, he can't help being dead.
Yeah, right. He did his best.
Yeah.
The fan club that follows Chesterton, and I say this with utter reverence because I know, some old men who are hanging on in their 90s who just followed in Chesterton's footsteps and kept the idea of distributism alive in the 40s and 50s and whatnot. And their work is, I think they don't appreciate the value of their own work because we would really be nowhere without people who continued this tradition, very much like what the magisterium does with our faith to keep that alive for present generations in its pristine purity from apostolic times. Nevertheless, there is a cult following, Chesterton, which I don't know that he would appreciate because I think he sacrificed his every minute of time and every ounce of effort, every drop of sweat for an ideal, and it's the ideal that we all care about. It's not you or me or him or whomever. I'm obviously not comparing certainly myself to anyone else in that regard. I mentioned the Greeks and Romans. If you read and you could say more than I could on this particular topic, but just from the very cursory, superficial reading I've done in the ethicists, and I'm not talking Aristotle as our primary frame of reference, or even his teacher or his teacher's teacher, but some of the lesser-known Greeks will explore the idea of what is justice, what is a just state, what is a just society. And we're familiar with the old Catholic / Thomistic Aristotelian notion of giving each man his due or giving each thing its due. But you will come across phrases in the ancients along the lines of a just state is one where there is not a gross disproportionate or a gross inequality of wealth between citizens. So you have a huge concentration of wealth in the hands of a very small percentage of the citizens and a mass of near proletarians, if not proletarians. When I read that, and I think it was in Joseph Pieper's book on the Four Cardinal Virtues, where he's talking about justice and giving bits and pieces of, what the basically the pre-Aristotelian thinking was on justice. That was shocking to me because it sounds, it sounds like a Marxist, right? Like, we can't have these inequalities of wealth, and sort of the whole tenor of the state is driven by its economic condition, very materialistic, very deterministic. But I trust, and that frankly, I'm ashamed I can't tell you right now. I could look it up during a break, but which Greek it was. But it was someone, it was a heavy hitter whose name we would recognize if I could remember it. And this, I find this is common in reading the ancients and their ethical treatment of the state, that there is a sense that economics must be ordered. We know that the origins of the word are household, right? So the primary focus of economics, however incredible this is to really think about in today's day and age with space shuttles and jet planes and iPhones and watches. And, we were just watching YouTubes of robots that are made by some company up in Boston, things that can now walk around. And, before long, I'm sure they'll start shooting us as well as our enemies.
Yeah, I've driven past that place. It's kind of scary.
But the reality is that economics is still about the household. And this sort of follows from your point about the family, that every scrap of material creation, through created by God the Father, through our Lord, it all is designed to serve man. And where does man pass 90% of his time? Now, tragically today, I don't want to pick a fight with you on something that's off the subject, but I'm a critic of industrialism, even in education. I'm not really sure anymore that I believe that the best thing is for kids to be packed into a bus and off they go to school all day long, even if it's a Catholic bus going to a Catholic school. Obviously, we don't want to get sidetracked on that, but there's a certain notion that the homestead, that even as aristocratic and educated a pope as Pius XII used to talk about the family homestead, you can't use the word homestead and think about industrial, mass-produced, machine-driven, or now we should say microchip-driven or nanotechnology-driven situation. It doesn't resonate. The diction jars, right, when you say homestead, and then you also think about this mass civilization that we live in.
Uh-huh.
And the ancients, obviously the homestead was a reality, and just as a quick aside, Penty, for instance, talks about the first 7 or 8 centuries of ancient Greece and the upheavals that they went through when they struggled with problems of currency and concentration of wealth, and that obviously provoked the ethical thought of the thinkers we mentioned, whom I don't remember who this one is, but I will look it up for you. And the Romans, of course, go through the same thing, the old Latin term latifundia, meaning this large estate where it's mostly slaves or men of varying degrees of freedom, but not the kind of independent yeoman that Jefferson and our founders like to fantasize about as the Greece and Rome full of these independent landowners and whatnot. So this all was worked out a long time ago. And again, I'm not some people would say I'm a Catholic Marxist. I don't think that I am, but I certainly, maybe I know too much history to be insensitive to the fact that the technology and the direction of the whole economic structure has changed things to a degree where the idea of the family working together to produce wealth to meet its immediate needs, that idea is as foreign as the old Greek language is to most of us, poorly educated Americans, among which I number myself for the most part.
Huh. So would you say, in terms of the question of the antiquity of these ideas, would you say that it's capitalism, along with socialism, that are the newcomers to the scene?
Well, there's no question, and I don't think there's no one outside of this kind of odd world of Catholic polemics where different factions, among all of the different factions and stripes of conservatism, liberalism, whatnot, there's little pockets of resistance where it seems to me people are obsessed with this idea of upholding the red-blooded American / Republican, capital R Republican notion of a free economy. We're free to make as much as we want. If that means we steamroll our competition, so be it. I think it was just recently, in fact, maybe just last Sunday in the old calendar, where we have St. Paul's beautiful phrase in his epistle, no one should circumvent his brother in business. You can correct me, but I'm sure that we had that recently. Maybe
it was within the last couple of weeks. For God is the avenger of these things, he says.
Yes, and I find it interesting. I mean, sort of present company accepted, but I find it interesting that I've never yet heard a sermon. I mean, it's rare you get a sermon that just explains the epistle and gospel, which would be nice because I know there are a lot of pew sitters who just. Obviously, Scripture is not something, we're not Protestants. We don't just take it and read it ourselves. We want the whole thing elucidated, the meaning. But I have yet to come across an explanation of what that means. And my view, perhaps biased, is that it can only mean that when you're engaging in business, any kind of trade, any economic activity, it's not your aim to surpass your competition or drive your competition out of business. That's not what economic activity is for. It's to meet genuine needs. And then if you have a superfluity over and above, certainly Thomas and every intellectual predecessor talks in detail about where is giving away your superfluous wealth a counsel of perfection, and when does it become a precept? And the more you have, the more it moves out of the realm of counsel of perfection, like nice to do if you really want to be a saint, and over to, no, you're obliged to do this, because the purpose of this whole economic activity, and it always has been conceived of this way, is to meet the needs of the household. So that I don't know if it's too roundabout an answer to your question.
But and of course, if you had an economy that was based on this kind of thing, that put the family first, and did have a wide distribution of productive property, people wouldn't be paying the insane amounts they're paying in taxes. People wouldn't be paying the ridiculous amounts they're paying for health care and all these other things. In other words, there would be, to the guy out there who's listening now who says, well, wait a minute, you mean I'm not supposed to be trying to make money? I can barely squeak by. I mean, don't call me selfish. For that person, I think we need to include in here that if you had a sane economy, the government wouldn't be sucking all this stuff out of your wallet. In other words, there would be some genuine prosperity as well.
Yeah, definitely from the governmental point of view. And I may be, someone, he's just a socialist. Well, may be guilty as charged if you insist. But I would say that the government, this is true, I think it's irrefutable historically, that aside from the hidden agendas, and I am a subscriber to Father Fahey's, or as I should say, Fahey's view of the world and of history. I know there's a lot of things going on behind the scenes that we suspect, but don't necessarily can't prove with firsthand evidence. But if you just look at the ostensible trajectory of history, the entire welfare state, the whole machinery of government that deals with economic subsidies. Not to the big businesses, which I agree with. You're absolutely right in that respect, and I hope we can talk about Amintore Fanfani's book in support of what you were saying about pharmaceuticals and whatnot. But the machinery that serves the common man, the welfare and the farming subsidies and all that's to fix the inherent problems of capitalism. We know in England that where the seedbed of capitalism with the textile industry. The workers were ground down so much that there was a question of whether capitalism would continue. And the government had to move in and say, well, we'll guarantee a minimum of nutrition, minimum in terms of working conditions, factory safety, health, working hours, etc. But this is because capitalism doesn't regulate itself, because the essence of capitalism, to distinguish it from your allusion to, say, Joe Blue Collar, who's got a decent job that he's proud of. He tries to bring home what he can for his family. Capitalism doesn't serve him. Capitalism uses him, and capitalism oppresses him. And everything that he does, while his motivation might be to feed his family, the system globally treats him as if he is a tool to be manipulated. As I don't know if it was Fulton Sheen maybe who mentioned that in your series of quotations where labor is bought and sold as if it's just another commodity. Mm-hmm. And that's one of, we could list probably 10 key points, 10 essential philosophical almost, if you will, but it translates into practicality, philosophical principles that are at the root of capitalism. And in an argument I had years and years ago with someone, which was in one respect a waste of time, but exercises in definition, I'm sure you won't argue with me, are always fruitful. When one says capitalist, what does that mean? Chesterton admits in The Outline of Sanity, if by capitalist you mean an individual man who owns property to which he can apply his own labor and from which he can derive wealth, he says, well, fine, I'm a capitalist and I want everyone else to be a capitalist.
Yeah, he also said that the problem with capitalism is that there aren't enough capitalists.
Exactly. And this gets us back, just to close the circle briefly, to this whole notion of the comment of St. Paul and overreaching one's brother in business. It's the overreached brother, which is your Joe Blue Collar, and frankly most most average American workers are the ones that are overreached, because the not only structurally is the system not designed to support these men so they can support their families, but the system is designed to defend the acquisition, the limitless, frankly, or unrestrained acquisition by the few powerful. And Pius X nailed it back in 1931, saying you have to be, he didn't use words that were quite so lowbrow, but you have to be a dunce to deny the fact that as economic power becomes more concentrated, this has a snowball effect. We know this, the anecdotes, I don't have evidence for this, but I believe it to be true, the anecdotes about the Walmart strategy, which is they move into a town and maybe open 5 or 6 stores knowing full well that they only need one of them, but they do that so they can absolutely decimate the competition. Mm-hmm. And when the competition is done, they pack up the other 5 and move to the next town, and that's why you have these hideous empty hulks in strip malls all over the country. It's disgusting places, with grass going through the cracks in the asphalt and the buildings falling down, because they were opened briefly to absolutely smash the market. And
it's worth it for them because they're making so much money. It's just part of the price of doing business for them.
Right. And imagine if you're an officer, a CEO, or a corporate official on one of the big telecommunications companies, and you come to a board meeting and you put up one of these pie charts and you say, well, we've got 44% of the market share. AT&T's got 20%, Sprint's got 15%, et cetera, and the one of your operatives says, well, I have a strategy that can capture us the rest of the market. And you say, no, I don't believe in that, because Sprint and AT&T, they all have men who work, the families that live off of the wages they get. We don't want to drive them out of business. 44% of the market share is more than enough. In fact, we should probably give some away to some of the smaller competitors so everybody has a fair share of the customers.
Not going to happen. Not going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, you'll be fired or sued for malfeasance. I mean, with our system today, the board would commence a tort or a civil action, and the guy would end up in jail for defrauding his investors because he's not ruthless enough.
Yeah.
And this is the reality we live in, but it's an ideological problem, because people think that that's what the economic world is all about, is driving the competition out of business.
You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre, your host. I'm interviewing John Sharp. We're talking about distributism, economics, as if God and the family matter. You said a couple things there, John, about they sort of tweaked capitalism in England when the excesses of it were so manifest, sort of the Dickens picture of capitalism, right? Oliver Twist and all that. That was the Keynesian economics, right? I mean, they had to the government had to come in and sort of try to fix it, and that was Keynes that came up with that idea, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was a response, but I think even without him around, it's inevitable, because you have the whole idea of the iron law of wages. I mean, you and Belloc mentions it in The Servile State and elsewhere. The ideal capitalist has a machine that doesn't need to eat, and all he does is fix a few parts and pour, in those days, shovel coal into the furnace or put petrol into the engine. And if the less you can pay someone, the better, because what's payroll? It's just an expense.
I was reading an American history book written by Charles Colomb, Puritan's Empire, it's called, and he quotes a robber baron from the 19th century, one of the famous American robber barons, talking about. I think this guy was in the railroad industry. And he says, well, a worker to me is just like a tool, a hammer or any piece of steel or whatever that I need to use. And if I can get one cheaper, I will.
Right.
So this clearly he didn't care about people. He cared about his own bank account. Right.
And let me, if you don't mind, I want to make sure that I mentioned one thing. I'd like to focus the conversation on a key point, and then you tell me if this resonates at all. And if you don't know what I'm driving at, we'll just move on, forget it. But I hope you will, and I think it's very important, because we can talk until we're blue in the face about the problems with the system and the various principles. Like Fanfani, for instance, in his book Catholicism, Protestantism, Capitalism, he echoes what you said regarding the pharmaceuticals and the other companies who have no hesitance at all about working with government for their own advantage. And Fanfani says this happened in the 1400s. The origin of capitalism was enterprising businessmen who had no scruples and were happy to work outside of the guild structures, which regulated commercial activities with a moral and religious end in mind. And their first goal, once they acquired enough power to operate successfully outside those structures, was to influence the policies of the state and, if possible, even seize control of it through whatever representative institutions existed or the executive structures of the monarchy to build themselves advantages, so to change government policy to allow them to do what they wanted to do. So, what you're talking about is unfortunately a very old problem. But the thing I want to emphasize, which is a struggle for every person who believes in distributism, and certainly I think it's a stumbling block and a scandal to those who we're trying to convert. There has to be an agreement if we call ourselves distributists, or forget the name. I mean, I'm sure you mentioned Sheen didn't identify himself as a distributist, and I agree with that. But I'm at the point now where I don't bother with the label, because when you read a distributist tract, even if it's not, as far as I'm concerned, well, that's distributism or whatever else you want to call it. Who cares what it's called? There's got to be an agreement, an ideological or a philosophical, metaphysical even, to push it, agreement that independence and ownership of wealth-generating property on the part of families is itself an intrinsic good. And I think you can label the good, in some respects, moral, because of the responsibility that it puts on the family, and particularly on the head of the family, but the family is a corporate body. The practical pressure of that responsibility, where the family has to work together for its own livelihood, and it's not just about the father getting on a train, off he goes, he sits in a cubicle or stands on an assembly line and then comes home. I mean, you can say he's free in that respect because he's signed a contract with the firm that he works for. But having worked in that kind of environment myself for many, many years, and knowing many people who do, frankly, it's a kind of it's a cop-out on responsibility. You sit in the train, you're dumped off somewhere, you sit and do God knows what for who knows who or whom, and it doesn't mean anything to anyone. You get a big fat paycheck dumped in your bank account every month, and you go to bed and get up and go to bed and get up. There's no responsibility. There's no thrill of living, like, look, if we don't actually get out and feed the chickens, we might not have something to eat, kind of thing.
Yeah. Now, John, let me cut in right there, because you made the reference to something clearly agrarian. A lot of people criticize distributism as just, and by the way, we only have about 5 minutes, although I might eat up a lot of my last segment here just because this is good. But a lot of people will criticize distributism as an exercise in romanticism and saying, back to the land, let's have chickens, let's have a cow, and they don't know anything about farming or anything, and they're doomed to failure. What do you say to the person who says, well, distributism is just a bunch of fat drunken poets from England who think that we ought to go back to the farm, and these guys didn't even farm themselves, they're hypocrites. What do you say to that objection?
Well, this is a nice segue from what I was saying earlier, that fundamentally distributism is about responsibility. It's about personal responsibility. So whether as the head of a family, and considering the family as an economic unit, which is something we don't do in America, because as I was saying, the kids get put on the bus and off they go. The man gets put on the train and off he goes. The wife does God knows what all day, getting her hair done or whatever. And the household is empty, right? There are no children and no people at home. If they sit down to dinner together, it's a miracle, right? God knows what they're doing afterwards, off to the iPad or the YouTube or what have you. Distributism is about making the family the constructive unit that generates wealth to survive. And whether that's because they all work on computer programming, or they publish books, or they farm, or they do anything in between, that is the essence of it. I mean, this, again, as I said, Pius XII did talk about the family homestead, and it doesn't have to be agrarian, but the family is an economic unit. And I am more than prepared to admit that today, that is well nigh impossible. It's not impossible, but it's very close to that because of the concentration of production of just about everything that we need. You think even you want to do some of your own home repair, that's great. But you go to one of these big stores, Lowe's or Home Depot, you buy drywall that's mass-produced in China or somewhere else and put over on a ship. I mean, everything today is mass-produced, and it's made somewhere else, and few people know how to do anything. And the ones who do know how to do something are specialists. I mean, you have some great welders, but the welders are employed in factories where they want welding done, and he becomes a wage slave the same as everything else. So it's got nothing to do with agrarianism, except, and this is the uncomfortable point for most people, goes back to what I was saying about whether independence, control over your own destiny as a family is considered a good or not. Because if it's not, you're better off being a wage slave. It's much easier. You put your feet up, you turn your brain off. You don't have to think about anything. You don't have to do very much except slog through what someone else is telling you to do. And in many respects, even though the will doesn't want to obey in certain contexts, in other contexts, it's much easier to just go through life as a robot, being pushed around and told what to do. You don't have to exercise any responsibility. The agrarian stumbling block comes from the fact that when serious thinkers, and I would argue that the distributists who most heavily pushed agrarianism did that not because they were a bunch of drunk fat guys sitting around in a pub coming up with crackpot theories because they just had one too many pints and couldn't bear not to speak in a rhyme, but because they were serious thinkers who were getting at the roots of the social problem. And the more you push this analysis to its logical conclusion, you run head on into the fact that when everything is mass-produced, are you going to set yourself up as an independent proprietor in the telecom industry or in the pharmaceutical industry or in, you name an industry where the things are mass-produced, highly centralized, highly bureaucratized, you're going to become like an independent manufacturer of Abrams tanks or satellites or space shuttles? And this is the argument, the ludicrous, the ridicule that's heaped on distributism. What are you going to do, make a satellite in your backyard? That's what one guy said to me, about 12, a PhD said that to me 12 or 15 years ago. Well, I mean, it is a good question, right? But the question is, are you telling me that's all that families have done for the last 8,000 years is figured out how to contribute or participate in the manufacture of satellites?
Yeah, in this country right now, more people work for the government than farm.
Right.
And in the later part of the 19th century, there was a ratio of like 20% of people lived in the cities, 80% in the countryside. That slowly reversed itself. Rapidly reversed itself, I think in the 1880s. I can't remember.
I'm just going to say that my statistic is roughly 1890 is the first time that you can point to when the balance notably shifted. So we're really talking not a whole lot more than 100 years ago that was still at least you could say balanced. But this is the problem, because the concentration coupled with the technology, coupled with the ideology that makes it impossible to even suggest a reformed system, means that it is only the eccentrics, the nuts, or I would say in many respects the heroes, who have the guts to, in some respect, use whatever cliche you want, get off the grid, or cut the safety net, or leave the parachute in the plane and just jump out anyway. Whatever metaphor you'd like to use, it is a struggle, and I can say this firsthand because of my own life after government service. It is a struggle to be independent. And there's the keeping up with the Joneses thing. Well, why does Mr. So-and-so get to go on vacations and he has this and they just bought a new car and blah, 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 blah. Well, because I'm the master of my own time, and I want to be the master of my time rather than the owner of 40 more iPads and 3 other Cadillacs and 3 weeks in Tahiti. Who cares about that stuff? But unless we change the mentality, there's really no point, because distributism is hard work, and if you don't want hard work, then go somewhere else. Go get a job.
Yeah, get a job, man. Okay, John, we're really running out of time, but I'll ask you on air so that you're embarrassed to say no. Can you come back for a part 2? Because I've hardly gotten through any of the questions that I had for you, and I really think we need to do a whole show where I'm peppering you with questions and you give me intelligent responses.
I think that would be great. I would love to do that. I appreciate the offer, and I didn't get through the 90 or 120 minutes worth of material I had prepared either. So that's
go figure. I guess we're not economic when it comes to the use of time on the show. That was a joke. Okay. All right, John. Well, thanks very much. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre. Please stick around. The final segment will be after the break.
Your guide to the reconquest of what modern man has lost. Think of it as a roadmap to truth with a crucifix as a compass. Reconquest is exclusively on the Veritas Radio Network's Crusade.
Welcome back to Reconquest on the Crusade channel of the Veritas Radio Network. I'm Brother Andre Marie, coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are catholicism.org and reconquest.net. Well, I hope you enjoyed the second segment there where I was interviewing John Sharp. John has promised to come back next week so that we can continue this discussion, because we hardly got into anywhere near what I wanted to do, and John had some other ground that he wanted to cover as well. We're going to try to touch upon some more practical questions next week, and you can be the judge and see if we did it or not. One thing that I always do on this last segment is ask the question, what are you going to do about this? I get tropological. Take what you heard before and apply it. Well, there's a certain difficulty entailed in this with this subject, because we're up against the behemoth of big government and big business and all that. But I will say this. Distributism is based on the family. It's based upon the small. It's based upon the local. And one thing that you can do, one teeny tiny little thing you can do to begin this, aside from buying John's books, and you can go to reconquest.net and find links to some of those, by the way. Aside from this, you can also start supporting people who are trying to do this. If you can't do it yet, support your local farmer. Buy milk from the guy that's got the cows. Don't buy the industrialized stuff. Do that, and you'll get healthier food too. And even if it's a little bit more expensive, support the people who are making the effort, okay? You've been listening to Brother Andre Marie on Reconquest. Until next week, God bless and Mary keep you.